It's as much about ownership of the past as it is about ownership of the present and future when we look at these fights over memory. And so I don't know where it ends. I wonder, my own views have evolved. If you'd asked me in 2011 what we should do, I would have been like, oh, we can use these as teaching tools. Let's put up a sign. Because at the time I didn't myself comprehend fully the way that these monuments were harmful to Black students and Black faculty on campuses that have them, for instance. And only through talking to students and faculty of color did I realize that the UNC monument was an active tool of intimidation even in 2009 when I arrived at grad school. I thought of it as a sort of a token of the bygone era that didn't really affect today. But I've come to realize that, when students literally change which way they walk when they're crossing campus because there's a Confederate monument, that tells me there's something wrong with that monument. And I don't have to, and that's primary to me, is that if a student can't get to my class, how can I teach them history? Because I might be able to use a monument here and there to teach about Jim Crow, but I don't need it to teach about it. But I need the student to feel safe enough to get to my classroom. And once white supremacists come on campus, it's a done deal. I do think there's a growing awareness of these monuments' ties, not just to slavery, but also to Jim Crow. And I think that's really helped shift the debate, is that that people have been educated on that.
So many of us, especially white Southerners about your and my age, who were raised, basically in a racist curriculum, racist textbooks.
An extremely young age, we should point out. Both of us are extremely young.
I start my talks with that now. It's like, I come from a racist family. I was raised in a racist culture, racist textbooks.
And it wasn't that long ago.
So there is obviously an evolution to, as a white person, learning all of this, and even figuring out that even what we know intellectually is not the same as understanding things emotionally. Obviously, you've evolved on what it means to be a good ally or accomplice through this movement. So what does it really mean to you now? And what are you trying to do within Charleston or within the community, as an anti-racist white Southerner?
It's a really good question. And I think, the language even there that you use is very telling of where we are at time. If you'd asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, I'm not racist, right? And now that term is sort of passé and people are using anti-racist because it is an important distinguishing feature, right? Is that being not racist isn't enough because it allows racist power structures to go on, right? If you'd asked me as a kid, I would have said, oh, I'm colorblind, I don't see race, right? And that's equally problematic in some ways because, right, it denies the reality that when I walk into a store, I'm treated differently than a Black person that has all the other same statistics about themselves, right? What I'm doing is there's a couple of things. The first is recognizing the limits of my own knowledge. And as you said, listening is really important, and believing. When someone says, hey, this is racially problematic, the gut instinct is to go, no, it's not, because you don't want to find racism places, right? Racism's bad. We don't want to see racism. That means we haven't made as much progress as we want. So it's a good instinct to say, no, it's not, but it's the wrong instinct at the same time, right? It's coming from a good place, but it's the wrong instinct because we often don't realize it. I'm also realizing knowing that I don't do everything perfectly. I don't need to ask forgiveness because that's not really productive. I just need to do better. And it's tough to go, wow, I did something that in retrospect, I shouldn't have done. I harmed society in that action. Self-reflecting on what we can do better and pushing our colleagues to do better, to actively push back, has become the most important thing though is to use your platform of privilege. I am in a privileged position. As a professor of history, people come to me because they want my opinion. Like reporters come to me. As an expert on monuments, people come to me all the time. And I try to always remind them that they should ask the activists as well. Don't just ask me what this means. Ask the people who actually bring it down. And I don't think necessarily I'm the one to give the solution. They always ask you, as a historian, what should we do with these monuments? And with the exception of those monuments that I have a direct tie to, I tend to try to defer to the local population. I don't have all the answers, and I don't want to pretend I have all the answers. If you'd asked me 7 years ago, if you asked me 7 years ago, I would have said, oh, I know all the answers because I'm a historian. I know how to make sure people learn the past, but this isn't just about the past. This has to be interdisciplinary. This is about the future and the present and creating an environment that is conducive to having more people participate in democracy. And so there's a lot of listening going on. There's a lot of contextualization. As a historian, I feel like my job in the larger fight to make these monuments better understood is to give the context and let others speak about what's the best thing to do about them. I mean, it's not easy, and I think I failed at times, and I think we all do. The hardest thing to come to terms with in some cases is knowing that you're not always going to be successful in being anti-racist. And when you're called out to say, okay, I'm wrong here, and just you don't, it's not about it making atonement, it's about changing behaviors and really pushing your colleagues as well to not just do symbolic actions. I mean, I think this is one thing we're seeing in academia right now is everyone's coming out with a statement. And one thing that I've been really pushing forward for when we do these statements, and a lot of my colleagues have been pushing similarly, I don't think I'm the only one doing this, and I think it's a good sign that we're seeing this, is that these statements need to have something behind them beyond a statement that Black Lives Matter. They need to say how they're going to take apart systemic racism and white supremacy in our culture, or they're meaningless. They're just, in fact, they're counterproductive because they're allowing you to think you did something to help undermine racism when in fact you're reinforcing it. And so I've been pushing very hard when we do whenever I'm asked about these statements, that they include active measures that are going to be taken, whether it be training in anti-racism, how to teach as an anti-racist, or how to hire better, which in academia is so important right now. You got to clean up your own home first, right? And my home is academia in some ways in Charleston. And so I'm also, writing for the public about what's missing in our history. I'm trying to give opportunities to others when I can. When I can't do it, I try to make sure to give it to those voices who are usually ignored. We can refer when you turn down a press request, you don't just turn it down. You say, hey, here's this colleague of mine who you've ignored, who maybe they're a person of color, maybe they're a woman who is often overlooked. Why don't you talk to them about what to do?
There's not really a handbook to this, and
I wish there was. It'd be so much easier.
I know. I'm like, if I could just write that one, then I'll be home free. We are at such a precipice, I think, right now, and even the most well-meaning people are going to stumble and fall. Even the most educated, well-versed, you could be completely up to date in race critical theory, and we're still going to mess up. And that's got to just the acceptance and knowing that. We've got to be fearless enough to know that we're all going to mess up and keep going. So I love that.
And we got to call it out. As a white person, one of the things you do have to do is you have to speak up when you see it. I will be honest. In the past, I have not been as good about speaking up, being like, hey, that's a little racist, because I wanted to get tenure and I wanted to not rock the boat before I got tenure, and I'm going up for tenure this year. And I'm trying to force myself to be a little bit more, use that place of privilege, because it's not a done deal because the votes haven't happened, but I have the book out. The way academia works, I've checked all the boxes I'm supposed to check. Even if it risks my own well-being, I have an obligation ethically to use that voice and to point out when someone says, hey, is it really right to kick out a student who says something racist, for instance, for me to say, hey, do we give that same chance to Black students?
Right.
Like, yeah, it is right to maybe say a student that does something overtly racist, knowingly racist. I'm not talking about microaggressions where they say something silly and they need to be taught about it. I'm talking about like they're using the N-word on social media and talking about how, Black people aren't as good or something, stuff terrible that is inaccurate and just racist at the most extreme level, right? That student, giving them a second chance is exactly what upholds white supremacy, is the fact that, the little white kid gets 18 chances when the Black kid doesn't get any. And there's something that I think it was Dale Murphy, the baseball player, said recently, which I really appreciated, coming from a baseball player who I admired as a kid, was that if you think that undermining racism isn't going to mean sacrificing some privilege, then you're wrong. Mm-hmm. Like, there's a certain level where it's not, you can't just be anti-racist and be like, oh, I'm just giving everyone else the same privilege. It means that you might lose some privileges.
Absolutely. And you're definitely going to lose some friends and family probably along the way.
Yeah, not to mention friends or family just by being an activist, but even just sort of societal privileges, right? If we have a less racist society, you can't get away with the same stuff you got away with because you were white. And I think about the stuff that I got away with in my life. and
Mhm.
and that someone who's black might not have gotten away with, and maybe that means that everyone should have been able to gotten away with it, but there may be times when it means if we're going to have a more equal society that there are privileges that have to be given up, and that is very hard, I think, for white academics especially to give up. And they really struggle, I've noticed, when it comes to hiring, the idea of hiring for diversity as something that is valuable to a department. They are very fearful of the idea that we wouldn't hire the quote unquote best individual. And I would argue the best individual, if your department is overwhelmingly white, for the sake of the students and the sake of your research being diverse, is actually to hire someone diverse. It actually gives you
Right.
viewpoints you wouldn't otherwise have, and so that you're not fully understanding what you need in
Mhm.
your department when you do that. But they want to have the best scholar, however you may judge that, and that may be how you write ads, maybe. But the problem is because they look and they say, "Well, what happens if I was up for this hire? I
Mhm.
don't get it."
Mhm.
And I think that they're seeing on some level, the people who are most resistant to taking diversity into account with hiring are seeing, I might not get this job because if there is somebody who's just as good as me who's black, which likely means they overcame more than you as a white
Right.
person, in fairness,
Absolutely.
um, I might not get the job. And that's giving up a privilege without even realizing that it's a privilege, right? They don't even realize the privilege that they've had to be able to get that job has been helped along by the fact that they were so lucky, by the fact that the luck of their birth.
I have a couple more questions and we'll wrap things up, but this has been great. I definitely want to have you back on. I could talk to you all day. I know you're working on lots of things for the public right now, writing in a lot of newspaper outlets, but I read that there's a possible book manuscript you're working on as well, titled At War with Itself, the South's Internal Conflict During the Civil War Era. So what's
Yes.
next for you?
So I've got a bunch of little projects to finish before I get back to that. I've got an edited volume that's coming out of a conference we did on Reconstruction called Freedoms Gained, Freedoms Lost, or maybe Freedoms Gained and Lost. I'd have to look exactly at the title, but it's a really neat edited volume. We had a really cool conference here in 2018 where we unveiled a marker to the 1868 Constitutional Convention, and we had 40 scholars present. I mean, it was really cool, and we had some amazing scholars here. We had Eric Foner here, we had Kate Masur here, we had Heather Cox Richardson, we had Thavolia Glimpf.
Mhm.
I mean, it was just like it was amazing, right? And so we're doing an edited volume with some of the chapters that came out of that I want to finish this summer. And then I have an article that I need to get done that's co-authored. And once that's done, I'm going to return to this book manuscript, which is my dissertation manuscript.
So I know you told us that you didn't publish your dissertation. You just went straight in to working on the false cause. And I read that it's possible that you are turning the dissertation into a book right now, right?
Yeah, so I've got a couple smaller projects, an edited volume, and an article that I'm trying to finish off first. But then I'm going to return to my dissertation project, which looks at divided communities, and this actually relates a lot to what you look at. Is Southern society? It's really a social history at how relationships fall apart during war and what happens once they fall apart. And we have and how you put them back together. We spend a lot of time talking about guerrilla warfare and the home front during the Civil War and how people are fighting against each other. But that's 1865 is the end of the story. April 1865 is the end of the story for the Army of Northern Virginia. But if you lived in, say, Rome, Georgia, and your neighbor arrested your son and sent them off to war where they died, or you live in Forsyth County, North Carolina, and your neighbor shot your son, you still have to see them every day. It's a little tough, right, to deal with that. And so how do you put this back together? It turns out the war doesn't really end on the home front until well after the war's over officially. And you see as people are fighting each other in other ways. Sometimes it's violence in the streets against old feuds. Sometimes it's suing each other, whether for wartime acts or post-war acts. Sometimes it's trying to disenfranchise your old enemies from the war. And it speaks a lot to why Reconstruction ultimately failed, but also to this period in time when white Southerners and Black Southerners are part of the story as well. It's a multiracial story. Had to figure out their relationships with each other again, not just because of emancipation, but because of the trauma of war. And so it really looks at how different wartime experiences lead to similar outcomes, where across the South you have lawsuits and violence and electoral fights that are really a product as much of wartime allegiance as they are, which we're shifting to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
And they're not always Unionist or Confederate is the other thing to remember. We like to think of this very, at the worst level where all white Southerners are Confederates. And then you have the level that most people understand it at, if white Southerners were Confederates or Unionists. And then there's another level of, or maybe white Southerners were Unionists, Confederates, or ambivalent,
Mm-hmm.
or neutral. And I take it another level. It's moving. People are changing their loyalties, and the enemy of my enemy may be my friend or my enemy,
Mm-hmm.
or my friend's enemy might be my friend. And so there's all sorts of different sort of ways as which people are trying to navigate and survive in a war-torn society leads to not a binary of loyalties, but a network of loyalties. And so to understand society doesn't so much take defining people's loyalty, but mapping the networks of friends and enemies that exist within a society. And it becomes far more complex when you try to put those societies back together.
Right. It reminds me sometimes of, episodes from Ozark or something where it's just murder and mayhem everywhere and you're looking over your back no matter what.
And that's exactly what's happening. Yeah. Is that there is this sort of aspects of revenge. People are out for revenge. People are out for themselves. People are out. Sometimes it is because of loyalty to the Union. And sometimes loyalty to the Union evolves because the Confederacy shot your kid.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's complex. And it's the complexity of society that interests me and has always interested me as a historian, fundamentally.
Well, we will look forward to that book. In the meantime, you guys go out and find a copy of The False Cause. And Adam, tell them where they can find you and where they should be ordering your book from.
So you can order the book from your favorite independent bookseller. Ideally, if there's a Black-owned one nearby, go for that one. You can also order it directly from the press. They have a sale right now. You can also order it from any online dealers that sell books if you so desire. You can find me on Twitter at Adam H. Domby. And I have a website, adamhdomby.com, that doesn't get updated that much.
It's a beautiful website, though. It should.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all the work you're doing to keep educating the public, especially all these white Southerners.
It's the same thing you've been doing. So thank you for all your work and for putting me on the show. And, I've been a fan of yours for years, and I will remain one. And I can't wait to see what you have up next.
Now, all of you at home, go ahead and hit subscribe. Thank you for watching Meritocracy. Go get Adam's book, and we'll see you soon. Thanks.